Imagine a new, ultra-modern, sleek airliner with around 160 to 240 seats, a perfect competitor for the Boeing 737 or the Airbus A320 families, in other words. Now, can you imagine that aircraft with Embraer written on it? And if you can't, why do you think that is? In this video, I will cover Embraer's chances of taking on Airbus and Boeing, and I will also cover their willingness to do so. Stay tuned. On the 20th of November last year, Kelly Ortberg, Boeing's CEO, held an internal all-hands webcast to outline the company's coming strategy. This obviously also included how he plans to steer Boeing through its many problems, which I've already outlined in many of my recent videos. Now, there are many takeaways from that presentation, but the one that is relevant to us today involved Boeing's current thinking regarding a new airliner. Something that would finally replace the 737 and plug the gap left behind by the retired 757. And it turned out that Ortberg's news on that front were not good. He did assure his listeners that the company wants to design and build this new airplane, but he also explained that in terms of the market and the technology available today, now is probably not the right time for it. And that's actually not that surprising, given that Boeing still has not one but two 737 MAX variants uncertified, and on top of that, a pretty big backlog of MAX planes in general to deliver. Now, I've also earlier explained how Boeing might want to wait for projects like the CFM RISE and possibly even for their joint X-66 project with NASA, also known as the Transonic Thrust Braced Wing Demonstrator, before they do anything else. But more importantly, Ortberg also added that Boeing itself wasn't ready to launch a new aircraft right now, saying that we're not in a financial position to do that. Again, that's not that surprising. Boeing will need time to stabilize and prove to themselves, their customers and the regulators that they actually can devote resources to an all-new aircraft before they do so. And this delay in creating something new is starting to become a real headache for airlines and lessors out there who really need newer and more efficient jets. I've also previously explained how Airbus is right now increasing their production, but that demand remains so high that their backlog for new aircraft orders, especially for the Airbus A320neo family, now stretches well into the mid-2030s. All this means that there should be plenty of room in the market for a third player here. And that was actually why I recently looked at China and how they have been trying to become just that. But like I explained there, China currently faces many of the same constraints as the existing players do, plus some unique ones, including geopolitics, which I'll get back later to. But what about Embraer then? They are already an established player in the industry, so can they make an airliner the size of the Boeing 737 or the Airbus A320 and maybe plug that demand hole? Well, for many of you watching this, particularly if you're in the United States, the most likely Embraer variant that you might encounter as a passenger is the E175, or even in previous years, maybe the ERG 135 or 145 models with their characteristic tail-mounted engines. Embraer indeed made their name as a regional player, starting with even smaller aircraft, turboprops like the 110 Bandeirantes and especially the 120 Brasilia, which became an international success with over 350 of them entering service worldwide. Now, if you look at the nose and cockpit section of the Embraer 120 in particular, you may see how the even newer Embraer ERG family retained the same construction and profile. And these jets solidified Embraer's image as a regional aircraft manufacturer, only competing with the likes of Bombardier and perhaps ATR for routes where turboprops were still in use. Now, all this was some time ago, but Embraer has continued this success with the E-Jet family, and the E175 has been replacing not only Embraer's smaller jets, but also many Bombardier CRJs as well. But what many of my friends in the United States might not realize is that the abundance of E175s in the skies and airports today is more or less unique to the US. The E175 is actually only the smallest member of the Embraer E-jet family, and while it is very common in the States, and by far the one that has been made in the greatest numbers, everywhere else on the planet, the E175 is actually quite rare. Alright, there are a few here and there, but its bigger siblings, the E190 and the E195, outsell it very comfortably everywhere else. That odd disparity has to do with the almost unique shape of the hub-and-spoke domestic aviation in the US, where there's a split between mainline and regional fleets, as well as cruise and scope clause agreements between the airline majors and their unions. These govern how many aircraft the airlines can operate through regional subsidiaries, how big they're allowed to be, and on what specific routes that they can operate. Now, I'm not going to analyze scope clause agreements here, or how Embraer and their customers got things really wrong with their E175-E2 regarding this. But the point that I want to make is that while Embraer is unquestionably a much smaller player than Boeing or Airbus, their aircraft are by no means limited to only regionals. The E190 and the E195s were actually big enough to replace some old MD-80s and Boeing 717s, and JetBlue still operates over a dozen of those larger Embraer E-jets as we record this. On top of that, the E-jet family and the re-engine E2 family aren't even the biggest aircraft that Embraer has now made. More recently, they have also launched the C390, which is a military cargo aircraft about the size of a Lockheed C-130 Hercules. And if we compare that aircraft to the A320, for example, the C390 is actually quite similar in size. Now, the reason I'm comparing those two is because Embraer chose the International Aero Engines V2500 for it, which is a turbofan that also powers many Airbus A320 aircraft. So Embraer certainly knows how to engineer and build an aircraft this size, with modern avionics and other systems included. It even has active side sticks for its pilots, which is something that I personally love. Now, here you might ask, okay, if Embraer are capable of designing and making planes that could rival the 737 and the Airbus A320, then why haven't they done so already? And the answer is that they almost did just that not too long ago, but stopped short of actually executing it. And crucially for this story, most reasons why Embraer didn't go through with it are no longer there. And while we are on the subject of things that are no longer there, have you ever found yourself in a new country but without any internet connection? Well, I have, and it's super frustrating, which is why I am so happy to introduce today's sponsor, Saily. Saily is the eSIM app that keeps you connected wherever you go. Created by the tech wizards at Nord, Saily currently offers super affordable data plans in over 150 countries, making physical SIM cards just about as obsolete as flip phones. Setting it up is really simple. You just download the Saily app, choose your plan, and then download and activate your plan. I always activate it before the aircraft leaves the gate. That way it's already working when I land. Saily is compatible with both iOS and Android, and they provide 24/7 support in case you would need it, which I never have, by the way. It's always been working seamlessly for me, and it's also saved me loads of money on roaming charges. So if you want to stay connected effortlessly when you're out traveling, save money and avoid the stress of getting physical SIM cards, go over to saily.com/mentornow and use the code MENTORNOW for a 15% discount on your first purchase. Thank you so much, Saily, for supporting our work. Now, let's continue. Despite the success of its E175 in the United States, Embraer's E-jet family suffered from, well, quite a bit of bad timing. You see, when a manufacturer launches a new aircraft, recouping their investment normally takes several years or even decades. So in practice, from the moment it enters service, a new airliner ideally needs a couple of decades or more in which it will remain relatively competitive before any updates are needed to ensure that it stays relevant. Well, the first E-jet entered service in 2004, and like all new aircraft types, it then took a few years to gain popularity, especially since this was a time when similarly sized turboprops were still popular in the United States and in many other markets. But Embraer's E2 which was essentially an updated E-Jet family, then entered service as early as in 2016, and this wasn't just a quick re-engine affair either. It had received a new wing, resized fuselage and tail surfaces, and fly-by-wire for all primary flight controls. Quite a big list of changes and updates for a plane family that was barely more than 10 years old. So why did Embraer do this? Well, the simple answer was that they had to. Because they were responding to the Bombardier C series, which today is better known as the Airbus A320. But that wasn't the only aircraft on Embraer's mind back then either. The period that we're talking about here is the early 2010s, and that is also the time that Airbus announced plans for its new Airbus A320neo family, which of course eventually caused Boeing to follow suit with the plane that we all now know as the Boeing 737 MAX. Back then, the Embraer E-series had been in service for just about 6 years, with the larger E190 and E195 variants being even 1 or 2 years younger than that. So around 2010, Embraer would really have preferred to leave those designs alone and devote any spare engineering and design resources towards something new and possibly bigger. So why didn't they do that then? Well, consider the competitive environment that I just described. Unlike the stale Airbus-Boeing duopoly that we have today, Bombardier was introducing the C series, which aimed to replace many of the MD-80s and MD-90s that Embraer's larger E-Jets were also targeting. And meanwhile, there was also another manufacturer that I haven't mentioned yet, Mitsubishi, who was developing the Mitsubishi Regional Jet, or the MRJ, at the very same time. That aircraft would eventually go through some extensive changes, but Embraer could tell that this MRJ, or Space Jet as it was later renamed, could directly threaten its regional E175. In other words, Embraer saw that its larger E-Jets were about to be eclipsed by not only the C series A320 and the big players, the A320neo and the MAX, but also that Mitsubishi's new jet was about to kill off the smaller E175. Now, as many of you might have already guessed, all of this wasn't just a coincidence. Boeing, Airbus, Bombardier and now Mitsubishi were introducing these new or updated aircraft because of the availability of a new generation of engines. The CFM LEAP 1 for the 737 MAX and many Airbus A320neos, and the Pratt & Whitney geared turbofan for the rest of the Airbus A320neos and for all new Bombardiers and Mitsubishis. The original E-Jet family used the General Electric CF34 engine, which had first entered service in the early 1980s and was actually a civilian evolution of the military TF34, which dates back all the way back to the 70s. Now, many other regional jets also used a variant of this engine at the time, including many of Bombardier's CRJ models, but they now quite obviously couldn't compete in efficiency with those new engines that were coming out. So, like I said, this was just really bad timing for Embraer. That's why they didn't design a new bigger aircraft than the E-series in the last decade and a half, but if they would have felt confident about the prospects of their own E-Jet family, well, then they probably would have contemplated jumping into the ring with Airbus and Boeing, and Bombardier for that matter, for a plane about the size of the 737 and the Airbus A320. But now instead, they decided to put their energy into modifying the E-series and to make it as modern and competitive as possible. That meant creating the E2, which now has essentially the same Pratt & Whitney geared turbofans that the Airbus A220 does. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps it was actually a good thing that Embraer didn't go for a bigger all-new aircraft. Because one reason why the Bombardier C series ended up becoming the Airbus A220 was the fierce, and I mean literally fierce, competition that Boeing in particular put up against Bombardier. Something that I have actually covered in a separate video. Now, that was far from the only reason that Bombardier gave up the C series, but the point that I'm making here is that this hostile, competitive environment of the early and mid-2010s just doesn't exist anymore. With Boeing basically focused on survival and recovery for the next few years, Airbus just can't make A320 and 321neos fast enough, so they're not in any hurry to invest on a replacement for the time being. Meanwhile, forecasts for future aircraft demand have actually gone up, creating plenty of room for an extra player in this size range. So, what kind of options does Embraer realistically have? Well, right now they have finished development works on the E2 and on their military C390, like I mentioned before, so that means that they have a lot of engineers looking for something to do. And one idea that I explored a few months ago was that they could once again try a partnership with Boeing. Now, those two companies had discussed this before and were actually in very advanced contract talks as a response to Airbus taking over the Bombardier C series, but those talks collapsed back in 2020 under the weight of Boeing's MAX crisis and, of course, the pandemic. And those talks didn't exactly turn into an amicable split either, with Boeing claiming that Embraer weren't fulfilling their obligations and Embraer suing for damages. But what I saw was that with Boeing under new leadership and Embraer still looking for growth, the reasons why they originally started those talks were actually still there. But such a venture would of course need funding, and with Boeing now set to spend the next few years looking inwardly to sort themselves out, that avenue might still be closed for Embraer. So should they try to go at it alone? Well, as it turns out, not everyone thinks so. In an interview with John Ostrower of the Air Current, which you definitely should check out if you haven't already, by the way, Ed Bastian, which is the CEO of Delta Airlines, expressed some doubts about the prospects of an Embraer competitor for the 737 and the Airbus A320. And he did so for a different reason, which was operational complexity. Now, there was a time not too long ago when an airline like Delta might have a short and medium-haul fleet consisting of a lot of different types, like 737s, Airbus A320s, MD-80s and Boeing 717s. And in fact, Delta had exactly such a fleet until 2020, along with Boeing 757s that they still use today, plus Airbus A320s that they began introducing in 2018. For a mainline carrier like Delta, the prospect of replacing all of those types with a fleet of only Airbus A320s, 737s and A220s would be very attractive. It would, for example, limit the need to keep spare parts for so many different jets, not to mention separate training tracks for pilots, engineers and mechanics. So for Delta, adding another separate type from Embraer might not be a very attractive prospect, at least not for the near future. But not all airlines have a fleet of single-aisle jets that is already so diverse. Ostrower highlighted the irony in Delta's current stance because about a decade ago, that airline practically cultivated a third manufacturer in the form of Bombardier by placing an order for the C series, but that's another story. In any case, Bastian and Delta today are definitely the exception, not the rule. According to the Air Current, the rest of the majors in the United States, plus several other big names around the world like Lufthansa, have reportedly informed Embraer that they would be interested in such an aircraft. Joe Anselmo in Aviation Week reports that airlines are reassuring Embraer that they will collectively order hundreds of airplanes if the company takes the plunge and really commits to it. Now, this is interesting because in the spring of 2024, Embraer stated that while they have the capability to develop a bigger jet, they have no concrete plans to do so over the next few years. So does this mean that there are airlines out there that are currently trying to talk Embraer into changing their mind? Well, talks like that takes place behind closed doors, but a company like Embraer has to secure hundreds of orders. So with so many airline customers involved, we're bound to learn more if Embraer actually presses ahead further. But it's not just airlines and lessors that Embraer needs to talk to here. One of the main reasons why Embraer was interested in that original partnership with Boeing was because launching a new airliner on their own would be extremely risky. Only the development cost for such a plane would today be several times the market capitalization of the company itself, and in practice, this means that the company would only start a project like this if they have a good partner, or two, or three, or even more. And maybe that's the real question that we should be asking here. If Embraer presses ahead with plans for a new mainline single-aisle airliner with a capacity between 160 to 240 seats, then who will be their partners? Over the past few years, Embraer have talked with investors and governments in India, Japan and even the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia looking like a likely partner for the company. But this is also where some geopolitics comes into play, because another country that Embraer and Brazil have been courting lately is China. Embraer's home country, Brazil, is the B in the BRICS after all. Embraer recently struck a deal to convert all their E-jets into freighters in China, something that Boeing has already been doing for years. And like McDonnell Douglas did with the MD-80s and the MD-90s in the past, and Airbus is actually doing right now, Embraer has previously had joint ventures in China to assemble aircraft like the ERJ-145, for example. Here it's worth pointing out that Embraer relies on a worldwide network of suppliers, many of whom are common with those of Boeing and Airbus. And as a smaller company, they can't have the kind of vertical integration that would shield them from industry shortages. Finally, one last twist to the Embraer story is something that one of you, my viewers, have recently brought up. Could Embraer just stretch the E195-E2 further instead of designing an all-new aircraft? Would that be enough to let them compete with the larger versions of the Airbus A320 and even the likes of the Airbus A320 and the 737 MAX 8? Well, that will depend on each airline's cabin configuration, although the 4-abreast economy seating for the E2 series is far from ideal here. But the recent move by Embraer may be a clue that they are considering such a scenario. And that has to do with automated takeoffs that Embraer have already announced and that they're planning for their larger aircraft. Now, this is a technological topic that I may have to cover in a separate video, but the idea here is to allow the aircraft to take off safely with a little bit more weight on board without risking a tail strike. This extra weight would then allow the existing aircraft to take off with more fuel, giving it a larger range. But that same technology could also theoretically allow the fuselage to be a little bit stretched, with the new automation keeping the tail safe from striking the ground. Now, that would likely still come with the need for a slightly bigger and taller landing gear, but it would be an ingenious way of getting around the problem with tail strike margins if they want to go down that route. What do you think here? Is this realistic, and how do you think Boeing and Airbus would respond to this? Let me know in the comments here below, and consider joining my Patreon crew if you want to discuss these type of topics in more detail with me directly. I'm actually just now preparing for a hangout with my patrons after I finish filming this. I would also now like to introduce a new co-host that will be joining us shortly here on Mentor Now. Because I have actually managed to convince my friend and fellow Boeing 737 instructor and examiner Ben to come in and present some of these videos. Now, a few of you would have already met Ben in our virtual Boeing 737 courses, which you can find links to below, by the way. And Ben is one of the kindest, most knowledgeable people that I know, and he definitely shares my passion for all things aviation, but especially for explaining things in a non-complicated and interesting way. I hope that you will join me in welcoming Ben into the Mentor family, and please ask your questions to him in the comments here below. I'm sure that he will come in and answer them. You can also find out more about him if you go to Instagram and look for Airline Pilot Performance. My name is Peter Hörnfeldt and you are watching Mentor Now. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.